Lovely. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the National Gallery Victoria, to those of you here in the Great Hall, and also to all of our viewers joining us on Facebook Live from the New York Times account. This is coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. My name's Matthew Anderson, and I'm the International Culture Editor of the New York Times. It's great to be here to facilitate this discussion between some of the artists and designers taking part in the Triennial. And the question that we'll be addressing today is, can artists and designers be agents of social change? Now, the New York Times is very proud to be the international media partner of the inaugural NGV Triennial. And we're hosting a weekend of talks and discussions here in Melbourne as the event kicks off. The NGV Triennial, it's the inaugural event, it's the first one that's ever taken part, and it's a large-scale art event that showcases both art and design, and it will be on here in Melbourne until April the 15th. It's the first of its kind. It's totally free for people to come here and visit, and it features work of more than 100 artists from 30 countries from around the world. And it engages with truly global issues from the environment, identity, to the effects of urbanization and migration issues as well. A lot of the works engage with technology in their most sort of cutting-edge forms, everything from 3D printing, scanning, robotics, and virtual reality, and in a way that is actually quite new and exciting for people here to see. So, to introduce the artists who are here to speak with us today, we have Alexandra Keheoglu. She's an Argentine textile artist, and she has worked with a multidisciplinary group of scientists, artists, and political activists to produce a textile work, which is presented here in Melbourne, that deals with a proposed hydroelectric dam in Argentina, but talks about environmental issues more broadly. Richard Moss has used the sorts of technology which are involved in the surveillance of refugees and migrant populations to make work that addresses the inhuman conditions experienced by some of these populations in transit. Simone Aim, he is a member of the Italian Amsterdam-based art collective Forma Fantasma, and the work that they are presenting here at the Triennial invites us to think about the scarcity of rare earth metals. Josephine Mekzepper she's born in the north of Germany, but she now lives and works in New York City. And she produces installations that engage with the language of modernism, but also with commercial presentations of the sort you might see in sort of shop windows. A video that she is presenting alludes to protests that took place against the inauguration of US President Donald Trump. Brodie Neal is an Aussie designer. He's based in London, and his work in the Triennial addresses issues of ocean pollution. And Eliot Rich is based in Alice Springs in Central Australia. Her work aims to integrate local people into the actual production, and in doing so to give disadvantaged people opportunities to acquire new skills. The question that we're going to be talking about is, can artists be an agent for social change? So I might start with a designer and start with you, Simone. What is it that you want to change in your work, and how do you think that what you're presenting here will do that?
Well, the work that me and my partner we are presenting here is dealing with the complexity of the digital tools we use daily, and how designers can come up with strategies to improve the recycling of electronic waste, since by the end of the century, probably, actually for sure, we will be mining metals not really from underground, but the majority will be mined from above ground in the objects we use daily and so on. So we thought that it was interesting for us to use this platform that the museum is giving us to engage with these kind of questions, both in sort of independent way within our work, and with a series of videos where we sort of try to unpack the complexity of the issue.
And for people watching at home, or for those in the hall who haven't had a chance to go through and see the exhibition, describe to us what we see if we go through.
Well, the work is divided in two parts. The first part is a series of videos which represent more our sort of pragmatic investigations, where we engage in discussions with different recyclers, both in developed and developing countries. For us, it was sort of important to have this balance, because a lot of the products we design in this moment meant to be sold globally, but we're not thinking really how then these products are recycled globally. And so we wanted to have both parts. And also we have some producers, which opened their doors to us. And another part for us was very important is we sort of engaged in discussion with Interpol, because it's the agency which is actually creating all those files and documents that are given to governments to establish laws in the way they things are recycled. And then the other part is a series of objects which instead are investigating more on a intuitive level these issues. And we decided to translate some of these issues in a series of office furniture, because we thought that in the way we use resources is similar on how the office in modernism has been shaped. So with this idea of apparent efficiency, which is the same way sort of also resources are deployed and used based on quantifications and division of space.
When you're there, I mean, there's a sort of a desk there. Are you intending that people would actually use these in an office, or do you want them to be in a gallery so that we think about those sort of more normal, I guess, objects when we encounter them?
I think the point is that when we, as designers, react to a commission like this one, we have divided the work in two parts because of that. So we have our pragmatic thinking, which is more going on in the videos, and then we have a much more sort of free approach within the objects, which they are not meant to be sort of solving any problem, or they're not meant to be probably used daily. But they are more sort of trying to address these issues from a more intuitive perspective.
Eliot, perhaps if I could ask you about yours is also quite a practical sort of sense of what it is that you make. Why don't you tell us about how you work with groups in Alice Springs in order to produce the work that you're showing here?
Yeah, sure. Not quite sure where to start the answer. Working in Alice Springs has a whole lot of complexities about living in modern Australia, working cross-culturally, across many cultures, with different desert Aboriginal nations. Personally, or professionally as a designer, I collaborate with art centres and organisations that I know have good governance structures, have really good advocacy models, and have good long-term relationships in terms of their employees with Aboriginal makers and people.
But the idea of your practice is that you're working with them and they're acquiring some sorts of skills through doing this, isn't it?
There's certainly skill to it, but I think really it's about bringing everybody into the opportunity and making sure that doors that open like that that we all walk through it together.
Yeah. But in doing that, you are thinking about some sort of a change that you're going to bring about in the people that you're working with, or is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, change that is rooted in place, that is built on my experience and the experience of other people within the region, and you know, change that is really based on relationships and have real effects that you can have, real outcomes for people that you can then see in the immediate term, but then also, you know, in 10 years and 20 years.
And what about, so that's when you're actually making the thing, but what about, so it's here, it looks beautiful installed here in Melbourne. What do you want us as viewers to think about it? Is the idea of advocating for change, is that finished by this point, or is it something that continues while it's here?
Isn't that interesting? My focus was really on the process and making sure that everybody felt empowered throughout that process. I'm happy for people to take what they want from the work, but to know that it was made in, true and open and genuine collaboration across many different cultures.
Brodie, perhaps you could, so your work which is presented here is, why don't you tell us about what it is first?
Okay, so here at the Triennial I have the Gyro Table, which is a 1.8 metre diameter contemporary rendition of an 18th century specimen table. Traditionally these were tables made of precious materials sourced from wide-spanning colonies and empires around the world. Materials like ebony and ivory and jade and quartz and precious stones.
But what you're showing here is made from waste from the ocean, isn't it?
Yeah, the contemporary rendition is looking at the movement of ocean plastic waste, spreading out across the world. And what we see here is an international atlas of the problem of ocean plastic.
And so what, in terms of, it's a different material that you're working with it, like why have you chosen to work with that material?
Well, I was kind of driven to kind of take action, to kind of pick up tools, and in the only way I really know how as a designer, to give form and function, material form and function. So here I was seeing this material, unfortunately, kind of choking our environment, where really if we can kind of bring that back into a closed loop circular economy and giving that plastic new life. It's initially created to survive a long time. Unfortunately, it finds its way into the environment where it can do lasting damage. So what we're doing is harvesting that back. It's the small fragments of ocean plastic which get smaller and smaller as they're broken up in the motion of the oceans. And we've seen that as the kind of building blocks to create this terrazzo-like table.
And it's presented, there are tables all around us in everyday life, but this is a table installed in a gallery, which is a really particular type of presentation. How should we approach it? Do you want us to think something in particular looking at it, or be in a particular kind of mindset when we interact with it?
Yeah, well, here at the NGV, it's installed amongst 18th century paintings of maritime history and also a cabinet of curiosities about the world's treasures and the marvels of the natural world. But I guess there's a real kind of almost sinister underbelly of the little pixels that make up the big picture of this table. You are first drawn into its kind of galactic haze. But when you get close to the kind of micro level, you see that it's made up from very, very small fragments of ocean plastic.
So it's talking very specifically about ocean pollution. And Alexandra, your work also engages with, to start with, a very specific issue, which, why don't you tell us about the issue that your work explores?
Well, the work I'm presenting here talks about this river that runs in Patagonia. I'm from Argentina, and this river is born in the Andes, in the glacial fields, and goes all through the country to the Atlantic Ocean. And the government has this project of building 2 hydroelectric power dams that will cut the river in 2 parts, flooding an enormous area of around 400 square kilometers. And so my work reproduces a portion of this river in a state before the change, before this river is changed forever. And there's a lot of reasons behind this. It is a very important river for the entire world, because it has this cycle of from the glacier until to the ocean, but as well it has a lot of information about the history of that place and of dinosaurs and of fossils, and all of this will be flooded. And this opportunity of exhibiting this work in an international scale brings attention to a situation that is being silenced in Argentina.
We're a very long way from Argentina, 11,000 kilometers away here in Melbourne. What do you think it means to present that work here, which is addressing such a specific concern in Argentina?
Well, for me, it has to do with, in a way, spreading this voice and the special context of Australia being a country that has situations that are similar or were similar. And given the possibility, this wouldn't never happen in Argentina for me to exhibit this problematic. The only solution I have or way to talk about this is bringing this, taking this outside from my country.
But do you think people here in Melbourne who don't know the specifics of the situation, but when I went in and saw it yesterday, it's amazing to see you're actually able to climb on the carpet, and there were kids all over it, and everyone was having a great time. So obviously people are reacting to it on one level, but it may not be the sort of politically engaged level that you may have intended. Mm-hmm. Are you satisfied with that as an artist?
With interaction? yeah, I think
Not just interaction, but perhaps interaction without the sort of understanding of the sort of social conditions that gave rise to the work in the first place.
well, my idea is to like heal this disconnection we have with landscape. So this river represents any river in a way, and through a carpet, being that is a thing that lies on the floor, we get to establish this relation with a surface that is similar to Earth. And my intention behind this is to get close, to bring this new perspective of a situation, of this relationship we have with nature or with the landscape. And through a carpet, I think it's like a close way, It's close.
Yep, no, I understand. So I think, I mean, from all of the artists and designers that we've heard about so far, everyone have quite specific political or issues that concern them. But Josephine Maxeber, your practice is quite different from that, isn't it? It doesn't really engage with a sort of specific social or political issue in the same way. Would that be fair to say?
Well, hello, everyone. I think, I mean, first of all, I think it's very important to look at this exhibition and to really understand sort of like the approach of, encompassing not just contemporary art in a triennial or in this kind of like international exhibition context, but also to incorporate other forms such as design and fashion, because I think from my perspective, because I come from like a contemporary art context, and it's a very kind of specific world that has become much more commercialized in the last decade. So there's a lot of emphasis on the secondary market and the value of the work. So the content of art, gets very much sort of intertwined with the market of the specifics of the individual artists. So I think that it's a very important moment to look at the function of art in a broader context in the world that is not just talking about politics, but also how other forms of creation can sort of create meaning and context. And especially in a time where, companies like Apple really shape our lives much more than, like a visit at the museum or music or anything else. Like we are, in a sense, really defined by the, increasing revolution that takes place in technology. And then on the other side, you have I have like a very specific, history with my family having been German, and my great-grandfather was part of the Bauhaus movement. So there's also that aspect of destruction and creation are, the two flip sides of a coin, where, World War II, in a sense, really, put a like very severe halt on the sense of progress that modernism and the Bauhaus movement created. So the kind of like revolutionary or subversiveness of design and architecture was completely destroyed by fascism. And so the works that I'm presenting here are kind of like showing almost like a sense of repetition in history, where the film that I'm showing here shows the inauguration of the American president of 2017 in a way that is reminiscent of like Germany in the 30s. So it kind of brings things back to like the moment where modernism and like the Weimar Republic in Germany, which was very progressive, were basically rolled over and then destroyed, and history kind of then had to kind of, I mean, like the sense of progress, or like the sense of enlightenment that has kind of shaped our
I mean,
thinking.
that's a political message, isn't it? Do you want us to think something in? I mean, you're trying to invite us to make a historical reminiscence in the context of what is happening now. Why are you doing that? What do you want us to do with that?
I think it's more sort of a challenge. Like, I think it's important that we challenge ourselves to look at things from different perspectives. I don't have a particular agenda, or I'm not trying to really tell people how to think or what to make of things. But I think, it's definitely a time where it's important to bring things in sort of like a historical context, and that's, I think, the specific work that I'm showing here kind of does that in a way.
And Richard Moss is an artist who also has quite specific concerns about issues of human migration, human movement. And I think, Richard, your work actually ties into a sort of broader controversy which is taking place here at the NGV as part of the Triennial. It's become something of a talking point here in relation to a security firm which has been engaged by the gallery to provide security for the Triennial, belongs to a parent company which also provides security at detention centres, engaged by the Australian government to do that. So there has been protest from some of the artists here. There was an attempt to disrupt the VIP opening on Thursday. And your work, you've actually changed your work itself as a way to enter into this debate. Tell us, what did you change and why did you do it?
Right, so I'm a bit nervous now, but so I spent 3 years working on documenting the mass migration refugee crisis, as it's known, facing Europe. And we visited me and my collaborators visited many parts of North Africa, the Middle East, and of course Europe itself. And that project was very generously supported by the NGV, and the project wouldn't have happened without the NGV's help. I thank the NGV for that. But when we landed in to do the final tweaks to the install a few days ago, we were made aware that there was a movement of potential protest of the exhibition by a group called the Artists Committee, and also by Candice Brights, who I look up to as an artist very much. She's a big influence. You can't really show work about the plight and struggle of the refugees and their journeys without acknowledging this point, this unacceptable fact. To do so would be kind of steaming hypocrisy. And I understand the situation is very complex. As far as I'm aware, the museum cannot respond to any of these gestures legally because of a tendering process. In any case, we as artists have a freedom within society, and with that freedom comes a responsibility. I discussed with my collaborators how we would like to intervene and respond to this. To cut to the chase, Wilson Security is facing very serious formal accusations. They're not just allegations, but they're accusations by refugees who are sent to these offshore detention centres in Manus Island and Nauru. And that in itself is a human rights violation by the Australian government. It's breaking international refugee law. And the outsourced private security company who's been hired by the Australian government to manage these offshore detention centres has allegedly carried out horrific human rights violations, many of them. And so, I can sit here and talk about allegations and accusations all you want, but I thought, I looked in the catalogue, the NGV Triennial catalogue, and some of my work is placed very meaningfully alongside a very interesting interview by a Kurdish human rights activist, journalist, filmmaker, and poet named Behruz Buchani, who is currently a refugee stuck in Manus Island. And he has suffered personally, physically, corporally, directly human rights violations by Wilson Security Service officers. So, let's let him speak and give him, hopefully, try to collaborate with him to maybe ask him for a statement. So,
and so how did you do it? Because it's, I mean, my impression when I went to see it was the change that you've made, in a way, it totally overwhelms everything else that's going on in the work. What did you do?
So there's actually 4 pieces of mine in this show. There's 2 heat maps and there's a...
But there's only one you've changed, isn't there?
Yeah, that's correct. And then there's a work called Incoming, which is the most ambitious of the 4 works. And then there's a grid of 16 flat screens. And that grid of screens, and as you first come into my part of the Triennial, it's what the title is Grid Moria. Moria is a refugee camp in Europe, on the island of Lesbos in Greece. It currently has something like 6,500 refugees stranded, stuck in the camp. It's only designed for about 2,200. And that's been the case for the last few years. I've been there multiple times. And each time the conditions are worse. And it's a very squalid place. And at certain points it's been a prison camp. So this is the grid that just shows conditions within the camp. A grid of screens. It's a durational photograph, if you will. So we decided to take one of those screens, the bottom right one, and try to collaborate with Behruz to ask him if he would like to make a statement about his experience with Wilson Security, in order to remind the audience that this is an ongoing and unacceptable fact that the NGV still has a relationship with this company.
And how accommodating have the NGV been to you in your turning your work into a protest against the organisation that's hosting you?
Completely. And it's very, very accommodating. It's still there. So what needs to be stated here is that this is not, this is a decision made by a state panel. This is a government decision. So the real people to indict here are not really the museum. Is the government and, of course, the security company. And if you go anywhere around Melbourne, you'll see Wilson Security everywhere in every car park. They're a huge company, and they're very close to the government. And I think that as artists, the museum space is a place where we can contest these things and actually try to raise awareness. And I think that's, if you look around the Triennial, I think you'll realize that the curators of the museum also are very much aligned with that point of view.
I think everyone agrees that the NGV have given a platform for everyone to speak about the issues that inform your practice, or the ones that you specifically want to talk about. But how do you think that artists? Several of you here have got specific causes that you address. How do you, as artists, have to deal with the other things that other artists want to talk about? So, I believe the Artists Collective invited everyone to make their own action against Wilson. Some of you decided to, and others of you decided not to. How do you, as artists with specific political concerns in your work, deal with the different or sometimes conflicting messages of what other artists might have to say? Brodie Neal.
Well, I was only really became aware of this issue in the days leading up to the opening of the Triennial, but of course it is the place for the Triennial, for all of these artists to be able to represent their individual research and support of these issues. And for us to have that dialogue, and the museum has been supportive in many of the different respectable fields, in providing the platform and the dialogue, like now, to present this on such a platform.
What about in terms of we've talked very much in terms of you all as artists and designers, but what about the audience? What about the public, the people who are coming here? So the NGV Triennial is free to the public, and I think one of the things that's really stood out is quite how diverse the audience is that's coming through the gallery. I've been here throughout the weekend, and there have been all sorts of people coming and interacting with those works. Now, all of your works have a message, or they want people to not necessarily think something in particular, but to think. And in order to do that, they have to have some point of accessibility with the work. Josephine, do you think about that? I mean, it seemed to me your work was very engaged with sort of European ideas of high culture, and do you think about how those are going to go down with the audience here in Melbourne, or when you show it anywhere else in the world? And you were talking before about the Bauhaus and very specific traditions of European modernism. How do they play out in somewhere where the audience won't necessarily have that kind of background knowledge to support that?
Right. I think, I mean, also to, you know, relate to the previous discussion about the sort of topics that came up with this exhibition. I mean, I, of course, completely support and agree that, you know, artists should at all times voice their opinions and to react in real time really to what, you know, happens politically in any sort of condition or situation. And then on the other side, you know, as an artist, you also have the responsibility to have your own distinct voice that is somewhat separate from like the political environment that we are, you know, living in, that is not necessarily shaped by us, but that is like a capitalist, you know, system that sort of dictates certain terms and conditions. And I think that it's the unique artist voice that really has like a value that is not to be underestimated, because it's precisely in the not just documenting or copying the sort of issues that are at hand, but sort of presenting different perspectives or counter worlds to what, you know, the specifics of like a societal or political environment brings. And that's why I think it's important that this exhibition doesn't get overshadowed by like a specific concern, which of course I completely agree is extremely important. But I think it's, in a sense, the function of art to have a different voice. And I think that should not be forgotten. And I think that, I mean, in my own work, there are very specific concerns. And like making a movie that deals directly with the, you know, last election and the presidential inauguration is a very specific context. But I, you know, I don't really, I don't see my function as an artist to document things necessarily, but it's more like bringing a different sort of poetic or philosophical aspect to the work, so that it's not just kind of mimicking the conditions that we live in, but it's a distinct voice that is bringing in a different perspective.
I mean, there's a lot of different practices, there's a lot of different political perspectives, there's a lot to think about in the show. Eliot Rich, putting yourself in the position of the gallery going public, how do you think is the best way for them to deal with that? I mean, do you think that they can take all of the themes on, or how should the public choose which are the ones that they should engage with?
Actually, can I respond in another way? Which is that living in Alice Springs or Mbantua has taught me actually to view my own effect on these global issues, that to recognise that I am part of a colonising settler community, that is an ongoing process that still has effects, and that being part of a dominant culture gives us a lot of power and a lot of privilege, and that often in my very local scenario, and this doesn't necessarily relate to this issue, but that often it's about stepping back and making space and not actually having the kind of ongoing arrogance and belief in the value of my own ideas to put them at the fore. That I think that we often don't recognise that we are all, especially in Australia, still benefiting from and continue to benefit from being in this country, and that everything is kind of organised for us to continue to benefit from it. So I think it's important as individuals and practicing designers and artists to actually see your position in that system as well.
And what would you change to make it so?
I think really providing the space to listen to people who don't often have their voices heard, and that is about us not speaking so much. In fact, thinking about this, you know, one of the, if there is, you know, it may have been better for me to actually stand down and give the opportunity for somebody else to speak in this instance, that would have been, you know, a more effective way to facilitate and, you know, bring about greater equality in small moments, but also on a greater scale.
I'm still glad you didn't, though, Eliot. I think we've had, we've had quite an interesting discussion about the nature of change. And I think there seems to be a consensus that artists can change things. Everyone here is a socially engaged artist. You know, there's an idea that artists can be agents of change. But could you not say that, fine, we'll all accept that, but are artists necessarily going to change things for the good? Because I think it doesn't necessarily follow that if you change things, that's necessarily a good thing. And it must therefore be possible that artists could actually change things for the worse. And so if we were to think that, what kind of responsibility does that give to artists? How do you know that the causes that you're attaching yourselves to, or the things that you want to achieve, are actually worth doing? Simone Aim.
Well, you know, when we had this chance to work for the NGV and we decided to start investigating the mining industry, you know, we decided to do so because we thought that designers usually are very much preoccupied with transforming materials into desirable products. And as designers, we decided to, instead of thinking about what actually happened to materials before they arrived to become half-finished products. And I think so in terms of evaluating in which way we can do a positive change, well, to be honest, I think it depends also on your own ethical standards and what you think is right to do in a certain moment. Definitely what we're now trying to do with our work is to tell people how they are supposed to live or how they are supposed to act. So there's no, we're not pointing fingers to anybody. And that for us is very important as designers. We're just sort of taking responsibility or trying to take responsibility for our discipline. And so looking at it from a more critical perspective and understanding what we as designers can do to rethink actually our own discipline, which has been too much preoccupied with producing new things instead of rethinking them, for instance. And that's what we're trying to do with this work. You could say that it's an artistic expression, but you know, our attempt is much more radical in a way.
Alexandra, do you think about any special responsibilities that you have? You've been given a big platform. A lot of people are coming here to see this. Do you think about what that means for you in terms of any responsibility that you have to the audience that you're talking to?
Well, I think I try to apply these things in my daily life. I try to profess being making sense, no? In the small decisions I take. And I come from Argentina, from a country in South America. I'm a woman, and so I try to how can I say this? To be as silent or as calm as I can, no? Because, for example, I don't consider myself an activist because I only try to speak about the things I know, and politics make me I don't know. I want to I don't know, close my ears. I come from a political context that it's very difficult. So I try to go back to the carpet and go back to the things I know and to speak about that, because the truth is maybe in a few years experience will change me, and if I continue this way of working of talking about landscapes that disappear or corruption, maybe my speech will change, but now I'm understanding the things I do.
Richard Moss, it seems to me that you seem to me an artist who is gripped by an absolute conviction in the the things that you're approaching, slightly different from the approach that Alexandra has. But do you also consider the contrary positions in putting your work together, or do you just go for it totally gung-ho from the position of conviction?
Well, I just like to point out that my work is really not didactic at all, and it doesn't hit people over the head and tell people what to think. And that's very deliberately an important aspect that I've tried to ensure the autonomy of the work throughout. And I personally believe that art must never creep towards propaganda, because if it does, well, for a start, it's no longer art. And in making my work, it's often can be very frustrating, because you cannot measure the sorts of change often that art makes in the world. Whereas I have belonged to a network over the years. I worked in many different, emergency conflict or whatever situations. And so I have many friends who are human rights lawyers or work in the United Nations, or NGO workers, or are volunteers, what have you. And they all are able to affect change on a very concrete basis, So a human rights lawyer is able to help somebody to win asylum in a country, or a volunteer is able to save somebody's life. Whereas an artist, it's a different kind of change. It's I suppose more abstract, you could say. It's perhaps there's a changes. It's a difference of it's a changes of perception, which is almost hard to see, or to, as I said, to measure. For myself, early in my career, my practice, my journey, I sort of realized that there's a kind of a change that's of conscience, and then there's also changes of consciousness. And so I see my work as being more on the side of consciousness. And there are collateral kinds of change that occur throughout the process of making the work, such as simple things like helping a family of refugees, putting the camera down and helping them into the van. They're all wet, it's the middle of the night, people are creeping towards hypothermia, taking them to the center to get warmed up. Simple things like this. But that's not the work. We have to really think about what change the work makes, and often that's immeasurable. And so, yeah, it's really about, if you can't measure something, you have to believe it's happening. I don't think I've answered your question, have I?
No, I think you have, and actually, I think what you're saying actually leads quite neatly into some of the questions that we've been getting from our audience watching on Facebook. The questions come in from Anna Reeves here in Melbourne, and she asks, how do artists see their roles beyond just exhibiting in gallery or museum spaces? Brodie?
Well, yeah, I certainly didn't kind of, set out to be an environmental activist. I guess that's just kind of been picked up in the trajectory of the work that has kind of followed.
But I mean, you're a designer. Did you expect your objects to be in museums, or did you think they would be things that people would have in their homes, or in a more day-to-day kind of context?
A little bit of both. I guess the context of the Gyro Table that's here at the Triennial is here because of its significance of a very timely environmental issue. And obviously being able to recontextualize that waste material into something that is a shift of emotion. When somebody actually sees that material, they have that moment of realization of what is actually the substance is. It really shifts the person's perception of the material world, the synthetically man-made world.
Why don't we take a question from in the hall? Has anyone, and please, if you can, address it to the question that we're looking at today, which is about artists as agents of change. Has anyone got a question which is related to the discussion that we've had here that they'd like to ask? The gentleman here. Someone will bring you a microphone.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. In many areas of our life, in many domains, people are trying to be agents of change on the bad things happening around us. The abuse of human rights, the abuse of the environment, and a lot of other things. And many have come to the conclusion, I'm talking about scientists, journalists, educators, about this problem of what we call echo chambers, that they all sort of preach to their choirs. And indeed, we are in an echo chamber here. You know, like members of the NGV are not your typical people. So my question to you is, do artists, or do you specifically, make a conscious decision to try to either translate your language or to speak a different language that will be accessible to a wider section of the public in order to be agents of change?
Is there a specific artist you'd like? Does anyone specifically want to come in on that? Simone.
So again, it also reconnects back to also the question you were posing before. Because we are designers, we use this platform and this possibility to address certain topics in this context. So we, when we design things, we are very considerate in the place they are going to act. And so in this case, it's a museum. So the language that we use, I think it's pertinent for our practice and the context of the museum. But for instance, with the work we're doing, we are hoping to take a different step, which will be to publish either a journal or a publication which will take some of the things the research we have done related to electronic waste to a larger public. But I think in the context of the museum, we are interested in investigating these issues from a different perspective. And in this moment, we are not trying to reach out for everybody necessarily, because a bit what was also said before, we want to use this chance to use our own voice, our own sensibility, our own way of looking at the world from a personal perspective, not with the objective of being the perfect communicator. We're not here feeding informations to people. It's a different approach to one you can have in a context like this. And being a designer, which is not usually the context in which design plays, for us this is a great opportunity because you can look design from a different perspective.
Wait, there was another question here, the lady in pink. Oh, yours is similar. Okay, does anyone else have a question in that case? The lady just behind you. Maz?
I wonder how this experience will actually be changing the artists who are collaborating in this exhibition. Has it changed you so far? You're at the beginning of this exhibition, and how do you expect being here and bringing your work to Melbourne, to this context, will change you as artists?
Does anyone want to take that, Richard Moss?
Well, this panel tonight has already changed my life of thinking. And I've been to Melbourne before. I have an ongoing relationship. I think actually the NGV is my most important museum relationship. And so hopefully they will commission the next work. How has it changed me? I'm here with my two collaborators, Trevor Tweeton and Ben Frost, and the museum was able to fly them in. And it's wonderful to be part of such a challenging, diverse, and inclusive and extraordinary show across disciplines. And it's a nice celebration for us because Ben Frost is who did the sound design of my piece. He's from Melbourne, and I have I'm Irish, many family members who escaped to Australia on the slave ships, you know. So I get to meet them, and so it's a lovely moment to reflect.
Eliot Rich, will you be changed by the experience of showing here in the Triennial?
I think that's an answer I'll have to answer in about a year. I won't. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to kind of synthesize the experience and the scale, especially coming from such a small, intimate place to then this quite amazing experience. But yeah, I'll get back to you on that.
Josephine Magazepi, your work has been showed in a lot of big international contexts. What's your experience of that? How does it change you as an artist having the opportunity to be in these kind of art world forums?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's also, you know, coming from New York, which is such a specific environment where, you know, it's kind of like the shark pool of, you know, contemporary art, where it's so, you know, focused around the value and, like coming to these types of like international shows is a completely different environment. It's much more about the content, and I think that's really where art really thrives, when it has that space to communicate ideas and be in dialogue with other art. So for me, it's always the most rewarding thing to meet other artists in these contexts and to be exposed to their ideas and to get to know them personally. And so every time I'm in these exhibitions, it's like a huge enrichment in that sense, because New York is so homogenous. It's very kind of like intense, and contemporary art at this point, has such a dual kind of position where there's like the market side, and then there's the sort of more content-driven work. And like in exhibitions like this, the content always takes priority over the market values. So there's something very specific that happens when you are not exposed to the very extreme side, and then get to experience the other side of it.
Is there another question from the hall? There's a few. This gentleman here in the checks.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious. I'm not an artist. I come from an advertising and marketing background, and in a world where changes are taking place now faster than ever, social changes, technological changes, economic changes, are happening so fast, we have to be very fast as advertisers now to respond to those changes before our messages become potentially irrelevant. So in that context of speed of change, I'm interested to know, what impact does that have on you as artists? Do you now have to work significantly faster? Do you have to get your artwork and out there and exhibit in a much more expeditious manner, at the risk of maybe, if you're not fast enough, the message that you're trying to get out may be lost or become irrelevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of exactly what I always fear is happening, that, art responds too quickly in real time to what is happening. And I think, if anything, art should have the possibility to pause and to create its own time and space, and not be victim to having to just be reactive. Because if you're only reactive, you risk that you don't have your own voice and you're only reacting to something rather than creating something. And I think it's an important time for artists to kind of step back and like have like a more distinct position on things, rather than, I mean, I think social media and like the increase of like the information that everyone is exposed to creates a very specific society. And I think if anyone has the luxury to escape that, I think it might be the artists right now. And that's why it's so interesting to look at works from all over the world, where artists are not necessarily like on FaceTime or, I mean, Facebook or whatever, all day long. I don't, well, I mean, that's my own personal.
Speaking of Facebook, let's have one last question, which comes from the audience out there. And it's not actually a question which is to do with the topic that we've been discussing, but it's such a good one to end with that I'm going to ask anyway. Do artists, I mean, we've had quite a serious discussion here. It's been fantastic to talk with you all, but it has been serious in nature. But Anna Reeves in Melbourne asked, do artists see humour as a useful tool to explore serious topics in their work? Anyone on the... Or are we just going to...
I mean, I think it's also a question about ego. I mean, like, the ego-drivenness of our contemporary culture is another huge problem, because if every artist thinks that their ego is so incredibly important, that they are projecting something to the world that, has some kind of, like, agency of change or any kind of, like, claim to... like authority. I think if you can get over yourself and also laugh about, your own sort of like, kind of predicament, I think it's a, you kind of are not really living life properly.
Well, maybe not so many laughs, but a fantastic discussion. Anyway, so I'd like to thank very much the artists who have been here. Alexandra Keoglu, Brodie Neal, Simone Farazin, Josephine Mexepa, Richard Moss, and Eliot Rich. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along and for listening on Facebook.